Before we get into today's stories, visit dreadsarmy.com to sign up for the Dread Weekly newsletter so you don't miss out on any updates. Also, check out all of the channels in the Dread Network on dreadsarmy.com or in the description below. Thanks for listening. Now let's get to the stories. I had a strange encounter during one of my camping trips a few years ago. Thought it might be worth sharing. This one particular night of stargazing and solitude turned into an experience I've struggled to wrap my mind around ever since. I've always been a sucker for wilderness and solitude, thrived on it even. The adrenaline rush from being in a remote, desolate place, it just rejuvenates me. I guess that's why I took off that weekend in November, heading up to the Manistee National Forest in Michigan. All I wanted was to sit by a crackling fire, eat canned beans, and wake up with the brisk morning air in my lungs. Just me in the wilderness. I remember finding this absolutely serene spot by the edge of a dense thicket, right next to the Manistee River. The view itself was enough to make up for the 4-hour drive. I spent the afternoon setting up camp, collecting firewood, rigging up my old tent, just immersing myself in the simple labor that wilderness demanded. It was a clear night. You could see every star in the sky. I managed a decent campfire, kept myself warm with an old camping jacket, and survived on canned beans and crackers that I had carried. Beautiful simplicity, if you ask me. I zipped up the tent after dousing the fire, and I don't remember how long it took for sleep to wash over me. Probably not too long. The fatigue after a busy day always ensures a good night's sleep. Now, while I love camping and all, you've got to understand, the wilderness can play some weird tricks on you. Your mind suddenly becomes hyper alert about every rustling leaf, every breeze, every solitary hoot in the distance. Usually, I treat it as a part of the adventure. Little did I know that night was going to be wildly different than my usual adventures. Finally nodding off after some tossing and turning, I remember being jerked back to consciousness in the early twilight hours. I still had my doubts if it was real or just a dream. There was this guttural noise, not too far from my tent. It was an echoing low moan, a mix of a growl and a guttural grunt. It was a sound I've never heard before, and believe me, I have heard all sorts of animal and bird calls during my camping trips throughout the years. This sound, it felt primeval, ancient even. Now, it wasn't too menacing, but definitely put me on edge. Shrugging it off as some forest animal, I told myself I need to get used to it if I wanted to continue camping out so often. I kept lying there, waiting for sleep to claim me again, wondering what could make such a bizarre noise. My mind dared not wander towards thoughts of the unknown. Dozing off, I remembered, I forgot to cover up the rest of the canned beans. Figuring some scavenger had sniffed it out in the middle of the night, I drifted back to an uneasy slumber. Unknown to me, the real surprise awaited when dawn broke. As the first light of dawn crept in, I could hear the chirping of birds outside my tent, their melody strangely comforting after the eerie sounds from the previous night. Still groggy from the unexpected wake-up call, I stepped out of my tent. The morning was beautiful, the mist from the river floating in lazy spirals. As I was working the sleep out of my eyes, something caught my attention. There were these massive footprints circling around my campsite. They were easily about 17 inches long and much wider than any human foot. The shape was hard to define in the morning light, but they had deep imprints. The creature who made them was heavy. The shape appeared human. There seemed to be the outline of toes. That sight, it rooted me to the spot, the echo of that sound from the night ringing again in my ears. Feeling a shiver, I approached the remains of last night's fire. Half the logs knocked over, my forgotten bean can crushed as if run over by a truck. The grunts from the night, the footprints. I tried reconciling it with a bear maybe, but deep within, I knew this was unlike any bear behavior I've heard of. A dread was sinking in, almost choking me with nerves. With heart pounding in my chest, I decided I couldn't stay. As much as I loved the call of the wild, this was just too much. Made my blood run cold. Hastily wrapping up my camping gear, I left that can of beans there, a quiet marker of a night I couldn't forget even if I tried. I wasn't sure what had visited my campsite that night. On my drive home, my mind wrestled with questions I didn't have answers to. Was it a bear? Did the darkness and my imagination turn a simple scavenger into something more ominous? Or was there really something out there, lurking in the thickets of Manistee Forest? The footprints, the dreadful sounds that had punctuated the stillness, the shattered remnants of my campsite, all of it felt so real, so tangible and yet unbelievable. I think I know what made those prints, but I'm almost afraid to admit it to myself. The mystery of those colossal footprints and uncanny sounds didn't keep me away from the wilderness. But every so often on a solitary camping night, around the glow of the campfire, I find my mind drifting back to that November morning in Manistee Forest, filled with an unnerving mix of apprehension and intrigue. It happened about a couple of years back on a job I was assigned to. I'm a plumber by trade. I've seen my fair share of unpleasant sights, but this was something else. I was working in a busy neighborhood, an old industrial district that turned into a hot residential spot. Plenty of fixer-uppers there. One early morning, on a trip for a routine job, I had the most otherworldly encounter. Every morning, I wake up even before the birds start chirping and dawn breaks. I've always been an early riser. It was something about the tranquility of the morning air and the calm before everyone else starts their day. You see, plumbing isn't normally looked at as an exciting job, but it's always kept me on my toes. I enjoy it well enough. So back to that day, I had a job at a former warehouse that had been converted into swanky apartments. The job was simple enough. Unblock a drainage pipe in the basement. I'd been there before, and I remember the place had a kind of eerie quiet about it. But that day, as I descended into the basement, the usual hum of the boilers and the distant rush of water seemed subdued, almost muted. My flashlight cast long, eerie shadows in the darkness, but I've been in enough dim basements to not let that bother me. Finding my way to the clogged pipe, my nostrils filled with a familiar smell, the damp, slightly rotten scent you'd expect when you're dealing with stagnant water. But there was something else, a lingering raw smell that I could not quite place. And then I heard it, a low, consistent tap-tap-tapping echoing from deeper in the basement. I thought it might have been a water pipe banging against the wall or a faulty water heater, but it wasn't the typical clunking you'd expect. So I decided to go and check it out. The darkness seemed thicker as I moved further from the glow of my flashlight that was still at my workstation. Then, for just a split second, my flashlight beam illuminated something unusual in the dark. It was fast, so fast that I barely had a chance to even realize that there was something there at all. It wasn't a rat, too big for that, nor a human. It was pale, almost ghastly so, and was moving on all fours. I could not make out anything else before it skittered back into the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest and a sudden chill ran down my spine. The strange smell seemed to grow stronger now, making me feel a bit nauseous. As I tried to process what I had just seen and what I was supposed to do next, a low clicking sound filled the air, bouncing off the raw concrete walls. It was like twigs snapping or clattering rocks, but there was an erratic, almost organic rhythm to it. The sound was both curious and frightening, and with it came that strange smell again, raw, musty, and metallic. With a deep breath, I called out, trying to manage a firm tone. There was no response, just a short pause in the clicking, which then resumed. I was contemplating whether to head upstairs and call the building security when I saw it again. My light tracing along the rough concrete floors and wet walls picked up the figure swiftly moving again. This time, I had a better look. It was a nauseating sight, like something out of a horror movie. This thing was about 4, maybe 5 feet long, pale and gaunt, but with an unnerving agility. It had an almost deformed human-like appearance, but the limbs were all wrong. The hands and feet, contorted and elongated, seemed purposely designed for crawling instead of standing. The soft light caught its face in such a way that only emphasized the black pits that could only be eyes and a large gaping mouth, devoid of any teeth or tongue. For a split second, our eyes met. Those large, empty black eyes bore into me. It felt as if this creature, this crawly thing, was as confused and terrified of me as I was of it. It didn't expect to find me down there, just as I had not expected to find it. This wasn't just some mindless anomaly of nature. It felt like it had consciousness. I have to admit, fear got to me. I'd be lying if I said I didn't turn tail and bolt. I picked up my tools and got out of there as fast as I could, all the while hearing that clicking sound getting louder and more frantic. Security was called. They acted like they took me seriously, but the look in their eyes said it all. No one checked the basement as far as I know, not immediately at least. The job was still unfinished, but I didn't care. I never returned to that job site. I heard from a fellow plumber later that it was concluded to be a large rat infestation. This was easier for everyone's understanding, I guess. However, the episode left me rattled. For weeks after the encounter, I had nightmares about those large black eyes, the clicking noises echoing in my ears. To this day, I still wonder what it was doing there. Did it get lost? Did it live down there? What scares me more is the realization that there is so much unexplained in our daily lives. As ordinary as we like to keep things, one can't help but sense the extraordinary lurking just around the corner. I want to thank you for giving me a platform to share this story. People need to realize not all strange encounters can be so easily dismissed. I have a pretty strange story to share. I'm not usually one for these types of tales, but this one is real and it rattled me up good. A few springs back, I was out here on the farm, just outside of Raymond, a little old town in the Midwest. Now, I'm a simple man, a farmer, and I've got this precious piece of land that's been in my family for generations. My day-to-day life isn't all that exciting. Not that I'm complaining. There's a certain peace to be found in the routine. Up before dawn, chores all day. In by sundown, rinse and repeat. That day was just like any other. I checked on the livestock, mended a part of the fence that had seen better days, and spent the better part of the morning tending to the fields. Planning, plowing, planting. That's my life when the growing season comes. And you know what they say. The secret to a good harvest is starting early. Every day, I stroll through each field before dawn, coffee in hand, taking in the crisp morning air and preparing myself for another day of hard work. There's this brief moment, just as the sun starts to peek over the horizon, where everything feels peaceful and still. It's at moments like these that I really appreciate how much I love this land. It's hard work, sure, but I wouldn't trade it for the world. About mid-morning, I found myself out near the old oak tree, the massive one that stood at the edge of our property for as long as anyone can remember. I had my earphones in, a bit of Johnny Cash to keep me company, and I was all set to start spreading the last of the mulch around the foot of the tree. The sun was high in the sky by then, casting long, sprawling shadows. It was just like any other day, but something felt off. You know that prickling sensation you get when you feel like you're being watched? Couldn't shake that. I've spent my life learning the rhythms of the land, the ebb and flow of the seasons, the songs the birds sing at different times of day, the way the shadows stretch across the fields as the sun travels across the sky. You learn these things, and you start to feel a connection to the place. You start to sense when things are as they should be, and when they're not. But, even to my own surprise, I shrugged off that feeling and got back to work. I'd kept on with my work, and all but forgotten about that strange sensation. With Ring of Fire playing to my rhythmic shoveling, all was right with the world again. Now, here's where things start to get mighty strange. As I was wrapping up my work around lunchtime, I noticed something out of the ordinary in the far-off wheat field. There were markings of some sort that hadn't been there just the day before. Squinting against the sun, I couldn't quite make out the details. Real peculiar. Seeing those unexpected changes in my well-tended plot. So I decided to go take a closer look. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like those stories you'd heard of crop circles over in Britain. But this was in my little corner of the Midwest. Sound as mad as a hatter, I know. But there it was, plain as day. The markings were intricate, almost akin to some sort of extraterrestrial blueprint. Spirals extending from a central point forming a complex pattern that looked like something Da Vinci might have dreamt up. Each twist and turn was cut into the wheat perfectly. There was not a stalk out of place. And the sheer scale of it. It was covering a patch the size of a football field, possibly bigger. I was so engrossed stepping gingerly along the edge of the formation, taking in the otherworldly artistry of whatever this was. Time somehow seemed to distort, each minute stretching out longer than the last. I could hardly hear much over the beating of my heart. By the time I snapped back, I noticed the sun was already beginning to dip near the horizon. I couldn't wrap my head around how long I'd been out there. A sense of cold dread washed over me, and I realized I had to get out of that field and back to the farmhouse. It's a funny thing what happens when you get rattled. You try and put it all out of your mind. Focus on the simple things that need to get done. Feed the livestock, mend the fences, and weed the fields, hoping normal bleeds back into life. But even as I tried to keep to my routine, I couldn't shake off that uncanny feeling. Every so often, I'd catch myself looking back out towards the fields, skin crawling with tingles. Over the next few days, that carved-out piece of the field became the elephant in my living room. I thought about roping off the area and calling in the experts, but stories of supposed UFO sightings and conspiracies about men in black swirled in my head. Unable to explain it, I'm now left with nothing but curiosity and unease. An ominous sign unveiled in the lush wheat fields, marking out a message I couldn't decipher, marring the quiet idyll of my farm. Each day it sits there as a reminder of something unknowable, unnatural out there in the world. Now every sundown fills me less with peace, and a sense of dread creeps in. I'm left grappling, hoping for an answer, some semblance of sanity in all this. But for now, the markings remain, a cryptic message from another realm. I'm not sure what's out there. Thinking about it makes the hair at the back of my neck stand up and takes the good night's sleep right away. Whatever its purpose, it was my proof that something more is out there. I remember this like it was yesterday, but then again, it wasn't something you would easily forget. The four of us, all childhood friends, had a sort of camping tradition among us. It was me, Kurt, Danny, and Bill. We'd grown up together, but life took us on different paths like it often does. However, we always made sure to reconnect through a yearly camping trip. This particular year, we had gotten a late start. It was around noon and we found ourselves on the path to Piney Hollows, the picturesque forest spot nestled against the Greenbrier River. It was just a couple of hours outside of Springfield, Illinois. Piney Hollows was one of my favorite places in the world. It was a smattering of oaks, pines, and maples spread as far as the eye could see. It was as tranquil as it could get. No murmurs of city noises, just the steady rhythm of nature. We managed to find a suitable camp spot near the river, where the ground was even, and the trees provided decent cover. While Kurt and Bill wrestled with the tents, Danny and I set off to gather firewood. The job was quick and easy, and so, with an armful of branches, we circled back to our base where the tents were just about set up. Although we all hurled a few insults at each other about how slow the others had been. But it was all just in fun, as we were just boys being boys. As the evening settled in, shadows began skirting around the edges of our tents. Marshmallows were roasted above the fire, and beers were passed around, and the story sharing kicked off. Some stories were hilarious, some nostalgic, some just downright impossible. The night stretched on as we sat there laughing and talking. Now, before I share what happened next, it might be worth recalling that Piney Hollows is known for its tranquility. It's one of those places where you could meditate to the chirping of birds and the whispering of the wind. Not once did we expect, let alone prepare for, what we were about to experience. After all, we were there to enjoy nature, share some laughs, and enjoy each other's company. Underneath the dim light of the camping lanterns, the woods seemed to take on a different hue. What was green and friendly during the day started to appear dark and shadowy. It was well past midnight, and we were still up, talking and joking by the dying fire. Suddenly, out of nowhere was an echoing call. It was a sound none of us recognized, a low-pitched reverberation that seemed to shiver out from the deepest corners of the forest, echoing off the trees surrounding us. It was impossible to pinpoint its location. It wasn't a bird, not any we knew of, and it wasn't the friendly chatter of a fox or the telltale growl of a bear. It was something else. That sound that planted a seed of unease in each of us. I could see it in their faces. The confusion, the surprise, the subtle fear mirrored in my own thoughts. But there we were, 4 childhood friends, in the middle of our camping ground, not knowing the sheer terror awaiting us as the night progressed. We should have left right then, but following the straying sound back to its origin seemed like a good idea at the time. Maybe it was the alcohol, or our collective curiosity, or just plain recklessness. But we decided to seek out whatever was making that noise. We didn't doubt our intuitions. After all, we'd stomped around these woods as kids and knew every creature that trotted, crawled, or flew around. Venturing deeper into the heart of the forest, our steps, drunken whispers, and the rustling of the leaves were the only sounds heard against the still night. Our flashlights swept across the underbrush. The call echoed again, closer this time, a guttural sound that sent shivers spiraling down my spine. It wasn't just fear, it was a sort of primal terror, something you'd feel when you know you're being preyed upon. It happened in the blink of an eye. Unearthly yellow eyes emerged from the darkness. We had found the creature we were looking for. It was grotesque in a way I don't know how to describe. It stood on its hind legs like a human, in a way, but it was anything but. It was some sort of giant lizard about 9 feet tall, with bright yellow eyes. It had the torso similar to a man's, but its face, its damn face, held the terror of a dinosaur, or maybe just a freakishly mutant lizard. Maybe it was the shock, or the booze, or the unbearable terror. But we stood frozen in place, staring at those eyes. The reptilian figure quietly watched us, its gaze shifting from one terrified human to the next. Its muzzle pulled back in a grin, revealing row upon row of sharp teeth, and then it lunged. In that split second, we became 4 panicked boys again. Kurt on the lead, we bolted back towards the campsite, every rustle behind us amplifying our terror. Without a moment's delay, we scrambled into our vehicles, hearts thundering against our ribs, our breaths heavy, and our minds spinning. As we drove off, leaving our equipment behind, I glanced back one last time to catch a glimpse of those glow-in-the-dark eyes in the rearview mirror. Once we reached the realm of civilization, where the city lights were comforting and the streets were familiar, we stopped. Silence hovered over us, as if words had lost their meaning. We looked at each other, acknowledging the disbelief etched on our faces. What had we just encountered? Was it real? A creature from a myth? A figment of our drunken imaginations? But one thing was undeniable. We'd walked in the woods as men on a getaway, on a mission to revisit our childhood adventures, and we walked out the very same woods, with a newfound terror in our lives, a kindred memory unlike any other we'd shared before. So there you have it. That's our story. None of us have entered a forest since. None of us have left the city. Call it PTSD, if you will. We've just given up trying to convince ourselves it was an animal. The image of that creature remains seared into our memories, and the primal fear still haunts our dreams till date. Since then, we took to a new tradition, reunion barbecues in the safety of our backyards, reminiscing our trials, errors, and the sheer terror that Piney Hollows gifted us. A few years back, I embarked on an epic mountaineering journey in the heart of Washington, deep in the Cascades. Out there, I had an encounter with something unexplainable. I consider myself a good mountaineer. The thrill of ascending to great heights, the companionship of the crisp, high-altitude air, and of course, the phenomenal view. It's a cocktail that rivals any other high I've known. Call me crazy, but there's something electrifying about testing your endurance and embracing Mother Nature in such a raw capacity. The most alluring part of it all to me has always been the feeling of standing on top of the world, looking down at creation sprawled out beneath your feet. On this particular venture, my attention had been captivated by a notable peak in the distance. Maybe I was enticed by its dominating presence or the sheer scale of the challenge it represented. Who knows? All I knew at that moment was that I had to conquer it. The ascent started out as usual. The crunch of gravel under my sturdy boots, the fresh scent of dewy vegetation, and the vibrant palette of nature's colors against the backdrop of a clear blue sky. What was different this time, though, was a strange, inexplicable feeling I had. A sensation I brushed aside as the thrill of a forthcoming adventure. I was about halfway up the mountain, my muscles straining in protest from the constant push and pull against gravity. Nonetheless, each challenging footfall only added to the overbearing sense of accomplishment. To the uninitiated, it might seem like an awfully grueling way of having fun, but for me, this was my kind of playground. Some of the cliff faces I had to navigate were precariously positioned, and the paths that snaked their way up the mountain were nothing more than narrow goat trails. My fingers ached from the cold. My back protested under the weight of my pack, but dang it if I wasn't having a blast. There was a particular stretch along the side of the mountain where I spent a considerable amount of time. There had been a series of minor setbacks, chunks of rocky terrain giving way under my boots and dwindling water supplies. It was a steeper climb than I'd anticipated. None of these frustrations mattered, though, not when you were playing in the grand arena of nature. Now, let me tell you this. As any experienced mountaineer would infer, mountain folks have stories. You hear whispers from the seasoned locals up in these parts about things that lurk in the wilderness, tales that tend to border on the fringe of reality. You don't pay much mind to them because mountains themselves are like an epic tale. They have their fair share of myths and legends surrounding them. Initially, I'd laughed the stories off as not much more than hearsay. Little did I know, things were about to take a distinctly weird detour. As I rounded a sharp bend, I caught sight of the crown poking up through another set of peaks. I stopped in my tracks, a sense of awe washing over me. As I reveled in the sight, something peculiar on a distant peak caught my eye. It was a silhouette too oddly formed to be a human, and substantially larger than anything else in my line of sight. I raised my binoculars, biting my lip in anticipation. As the silhouette came into focus, my breath hitched in my throat. There, standing a significant distance away on a neighboring peak, was this colossal figure with a striking height of maybe 8 or 9 feet tall, if I had to judge from the landscape around it. From this distance, it was tough to make out the facial details, but the glint of reddish-brown hair all over its body was unmistakable. As the rays of the sun dimmed, my view of the figure grew murkier and the details blurrier. It let out a deep howl. I don't know why, possibly in frustration or a hollow call to its kin. It echoed down the valley. The sound of the creature was so powerful, it triggered a small avalanche in a far-off mountain face. Suddenly, a gusty, harsh wind whipped up, blowing icy spindles into my face, causing me to adjust my stance and, unavoidably, lose sight of the creature for a moment. An uncomfortable chill ran down my spine, not because of the cold wind, but the realization that I was in the wild, surrounded by unpredictable elements of nature where anything, however unimaginable, was plausible. When I found my footing and adjusted my grip on the binoculars, I scanned the entirety of that peak again, but the figure was nowhere to be found. The silhouette vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. This left me shocked and freezing in the biting wind, on a rock halfway to the world's ceiling. In the chilly evening, having negotiated successfully with gravity to steer clear of a tumble down the jagged cliff, I found my way back to the base. The crackling campfire beckoned against the darkness of the mountain range and the eeriness of my encounter. Since that day, I've often found myself reflecting on what I had witnessed. A part of me questioned whether it was merely the play of light and shadows against the imposing backdrop of the mountain. Yet the howl, the silhouette, the imposing stature, deep-set eyes, and the gobsmacking disappearance are far too detailed to shake off as a mere trick of the light. Sharing this with others never felt like an option. Since then, every wait for dawn and every returned gaze at the forbidden peaks has been laced with a renewed sense of curiosity and a shudder of fear. After all, mountains have always been rich with myths and legends. Who knows what could be lurking, waiting, and watching in those far-off, untamed wildernesses?